And so we took a walk, and over the course of our walk, we were like, well, how can this workshop not be just reflecting on what happened? Like, how can it be a continuation of this work with the members of alternate roots who also do work like this? And so we wanted to look at, well, how do you evaluate work like this? Like, how do you know you did the right thing? Or how do you know that, what you could have done better? How do you know you served the community in some substantial way? And so we were like, okay, well, let's get some of the people who got really deep into it and really gave a lot of themselves to come together and kind of ponder this, like actively check in with you, and through that check-in process, ask y'all like what y'all think, like as a community who was in this project, like how how might we have structured or designed this differently? How might we have thought on the front end about evaluation?
Hey, everybody. Daniel's residency was part of the Cape way to engage artists and community in building a participatory art something moment. And one of our challenges was to really think about how to have some type of data or metrics or something that showed impact or how people even reacted to it or some qualitative measure. And that just got me and Daniel thinking kind of bigger picture about the nonprofit industrial complex. And is it even like worth it? Can we just do something just because it's a good thing to do? I mean, do we have to have all this justification for why we did something and collect demographics? And so, I mean, while we're also thinking about land and power and specifics, I think there's also a larger conversation to have about doing something because it's beautiful or kind or you know is needed or calls to the common good. And so, I just want us to hold those two tensions and have a conversation.
For what it's worth, whatever you want to take from what we've shared, great. If you want to go in a completely different direction, I would love that. And it would be an epiphany and revelation for me.
For my thesis, I've been talking a lot about place and power and land um, in the context of African Americans here in Lafayette County. And so obviously the stuff that we did and presented on and talked about at Land and Power was a part of my life, an important part of my life and research prior to, and it's remained the same way. And I think, you know, there's room for every kind of action and contemplation in the world. And I think because we've had so much going on as a country, we've talked so much about like direct action and things of that nature, sometimes we miss out on the fact that having the conversation is important. Whatever you can do to provide opportunities to discuss, especially difficult topics, or, as Effie said, one of the things that came out of Land and Power and some of the other land summits, because there have been a couple over the last few years, is to really direct landowners to resources or people that can assist them with what they're trying to do. Especially where it comes to estate planning and things of that nature, or all that kind of stuff. So there's a opening the conversation thing, right? And then the action from that comes into people feeling empowered, encouraged, supported, and resourced in doing whatever they need to do to improve their community, especially as it pertains to land and resources.
And the other thing that you might not, Daniel, think was so significant that you did with Power and Land is those little corns, the land corn. Do you know how much during the sale of our land to have a piece of that for our legacy, that was something to tear up about? So With that, some of the land was sold because family could not agree. So when you talk about how could this help the community, one thing needs to happen. Laws need to change. Laws that was instituted 50 years ago that if a family member couldn't get along and this didn't happen, just sell the stuff on the steps. You can't agree. So we're going to have two groups of people. The people who want to sell and the people who don't want to sell. We're going to split it down the middle and we're going to divide it. So my daughter and I talked and we said, she's like, Mom, I know this is going to hurt. Sell your part in that drama. And then my daughter and I said, you know what? We'll find some more land. We'll get Daniel corn that he gave us and we'll plant it under a tree and we will start our dad's legacy from that land. So you might not think that little corn was something, but it was. And that is what I'm going to do.
As you know, I work for a nonprofit, and as a person involved in the work, and always wondering myself, does our work have value for the community? Is it really having an impact? Because often our work is sort of long-term thinking, planting seeds. And so we, on a bad day, I'm always like, does anything I do actually make a difference or matter in this world? Like, I don't know. So one of the things that evaluation has done, I would say, for me as a practitioner and for the collective that I work with, is it just sort of keeps us going, because when the evaluator puts in front of us, here's what you did in the past year, instead of feeling like I'm just spinning my wheels on those bad days, I'm like, oh, wow, we actually did a lot. Like, it's very reinforcing. And then the qualitative part of hearing from people about the impacts on their life, which sometimes doesn't happen until 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 years later, is, that's what is like, okay, thank you.
I'm coming from a couple of different places. Like, as a former K through 12 teacher, I understand about evaluation and testing to the point of like idiocy, that kind of stuff. Like, and then when I was an academic librarian, it was like, we were told in library school, you keep stats because you got to justify your reason for existence. And I do think, those are two very different types of evaluation. But when I think about the types of evaluation, those two things, and try to apply it to land and power, they don't fit. Obviously you can count, like depth of penetration in the community, like who was there, who was a participant, who collaborated, how many people were there. So every place you touch, you can do that kind of basic statistical analysis and all that. But I would agree with what everybody else has said. So much of that is much more about how impactful were you to opening the dialogue in the community? How impactful were you in bringing folks together that would normally not necessarily be together, and allowing people to kind of break out of their shells and their spots to be able to see their community as a larger whole.
That makes me think directly about what Rondalyn had to say about, you have conversations, you provide opportunities to discuss different subjects, and then hopefully that action directs people to resources. And you said 4 things, I only wrote 3 of them down. So if you remember the 4th when I say this, let me know. You said, empowered, make people feel empowered, encouraged,
supported. I know I said supported.
Supported, and then resourced.
Yeah, and resourced. Yeah, those were the 4.
I think in looking at, well, what could have been different, like what if the project was seen as just a relationship building exercise between the museum and the community. And then the people who really participated, the museum follows up with them. And you know, you've got Effie here who's like, laws, like this made me think about what's going on relative to my experience, and laws is the thing that I want to change. And then now we resource that. It could inform a different way to think about, you know, what's the role of the project. Like the project isn't the end, it's this phase of, this is how we relationship and build to then get to, well, how do we service the people that interact with them.
What's interesting about that, and I know Effie knows more about this than I do through her mom and her parents, but that's, you know, the fact that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services grew out of a law clinic. So there was so much need that eventually it became a separate entity. And I think partnerships and collaborations, like just because the Museum of Art is not about that legal life, you know what I'm saying, doesn't mean they can't collaborate and tell the story of these lives, so to speak. So I think art, storytelling, all those things, all those different types of art, as I should say, all lend themselves to inviting people into the conversation.
And what you're saying, I think also like speaks to artifacts, you know, like what remains after the project is over, you know, and it's these stories and narratives that themselves can then be used to further, you know, that story and narrative is a resource.
Mm-hmm. It
and
is.
I think, yeah, supporting the use of that resource could have simply been networking, you know, going to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services who participated and saying, oh, well, in the wake of the summit, we realized, you know, there's an interest from this other member in the law around this, you know, because they may already be working on that and could really use a narrative to just drop into the legal work that they're doing around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you know, as thinking about, you know, the inside outside game. So yes, but funders want distinct measurables, and as a grantee, it might be interesting for us to say, hey, we can get you this, but maybe you're asking the wrong questions. And for us to model what the new questions are, thinking about like the number of relationships created, or who was inspired to do something. I mean, you remember at one of the events that I did, like we measured success by people that filled out voter registration information. So, you know, I think we just need to think about it, we need to shift our paradigm first and then model.
I framed earlier evaluation as the practitioner from a member of the nonprofit. But in this case, you know, I'm community member, participant, and want to give feedback about this for evaluation. And so I, for years, had been struggling with this real kind of binary that I was either an artist or I was practicing in this other way of racial justice work. And that tension just, you know, really weighed at me. And even though my art practice has always focused on the same topics of racial justice, you know, history, all of these things, the process of this, the conversations with Daniel in particular, but just the whole process of it really helped me come to a place of really claiming that space of social practice, and thinking of myself as like this whole practitioner. And that's something that I do carry with me every day, even, you know, as a sort of, you know, if I'm not consciously thinking about it, it really does impact me in the way that I feel good about my work and feel good about myself and feel whole as a person.
But probably one of the best things I remember about Land Empowered that was not on the 17th was actually the conversation that we all had at YAC, where it was a cross section of the community that wouldn't normally get together. And they talked about land in so many different ways, like affordable housing and how residential spaces are designed, what settlement patterns are, what they really indicate versus what we think they indicate. Space and place, and what is people's place in this community, who gets to decide who's, so there were all these, not side conversations, because they were all intimately connected with land and power.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that back up, Rondalyn, because the process, the lead up to the main event was a lot of smaller conversations that even reflected the even smaller conversations that Daniel was having one-on-one with people, and then I would come up once a quarter. And I just think, capitalism has the tendency to focus on productivity and speed, and relationships are built on time and patience. And how do you kind of you got to navigate the both of those world, and that's a tension for me. And institutions really don't want to invest time.
Are you familiar with the artist Mark Lombardi, who did visualizations of all of these different corporations and politicians and these networks between them all? And it was this very powerful visualization of how so much power is concentrated in certain political hands, but also that link to capitalism. But it made me actually think, as we were talking about all these networks and these long-term, these relationships, it's much more interesting to me to think about visualizing all of these relationships that we're talking about. Like, Rondalyn, your stories of, you're bringing in North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, which I've done oral history work, which Effie's mother worked for, which, has done so much to empower people in this community, this area, this region. That's just something that rose up for me, is the power of all of these connections that we're talking about, the power of the relationships.
Kind of April, I mean, we are an art museum. Wouldn't it be interesting to say, hey, artists that we gave money to, is there a way that you can translate the new relationships or all of these to some artwork? That is fascinating, and I'm gonna think about it.
Above me usually is actually a picture I was given by one of the artists from Land and Power. I had remarked so much on how lifelike the picture was of the young man, and everybody that sees this piece of art had something to say about it. So it was behind me in class, like it's been behind me all the time. So when we started going on Zoom for class last spring, everybody that came into my house, for class, me being a student, would would see that every week. But I had a classmate on the last day of class in May, or whenever we met last. She asked me about that painting. She said, I look forward to seeing that painting every week behind you. And I just want to ask you about that painting. And so I ended up explaining to her about Land and Power and about the particular painting. And she was just flabbergasted by it. But, that's a whole class that was dealing with like ethnic and race studies and sociology, that's been looking at this picture or looking at a product of Land and Power and talking about the issues in class that this picture represents, and didn't know about it until the end of class. So I don't know if that makes sense the way I'm saying it, but it is very cyclical in the kinds of impacts that you can make from something that nobody was even there for, so.
My father always used to say, if something isn't going to work out for you and you're working on it, that does not mean you stop working on it when it doesn't work for you. That means you work on it harder and you continue to work on it for the next people. It's not now about you, it's about the next people. And so maybe we sit here and say, oh, what did I do? Well, you fed into me, you fed into my daughter and my granddaughter. That's 3 generations right there with the corn.